It was the autumn of 2003 in a quiet Ohio suburb, a place where nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen. The kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked, and children rode their bikes down the street until the evening sky turned purple and the streetlights flickered on. The houses looked nearly identical, modest, single-family homes with white fences and trimmed lawns, and in that ordinariness lay a strange sense of safety. But behind the glass windows of one particular house, a secret was forming, a darkness that no one in the neighborhood could imagine. Sarah Miller, a 20-year-old college student, lived only a few blocks away from that house. She was the kind of girl people remembered for her smile, always early to class, always helping her friends, the kind of person who seemed destined for something bright. On the evening of October 14th, she left campus after her late literature lecture. She called her roommate to say she would be home in 15 minutes, but she never arrived. Her disappearance was like a crack in the perfect glass surface of the town, a fracture that would only deepen as hours turned to days. At first, her friends assumed she might have gone to the library. Maybe she stayed with another friend. Maybe she needed time alone. But when morning came and her phone still went unanswered, panic began to creep in. Her parents drove from 3 towns away and filed a missing person report, their voices shaking as they told police that their daughter was responsible, not the type to vanish. The police began with routine questions, boyfriends, arguments, stress, but Sarah's life seemed painfully normal. No drama, no enemies, just an ordinary student with a promising future. The lack of leads made her case harder from the very beginning. Flyers were printed with her face, her blonde hair framing a hopeful smile, and they were taped to lampposts, grocery stores, bus stops, each one a plea to strangers to help find her. News anchors repeated her name every night, her story weaving itself into the living rooms of families who locked their doors a little tighter before bed. Weeks passed, but no one came forward. The town grew restless. Some whispered she had run away. Others feared the worst. For her parents, every night was agony, sitting by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. What no one knew was that Sarah had not left town. She had not vanished into thin air. She was trapped only a few blocks away, hidden in the most ordinary house on the street. That house belonged to Richard Coleman, a 48-year-old man who lived alone. Richard was an enigma to his neighbors, polite but distant, always seen in old flannel shirts, his car rarely leaving the driveway. Children whispered that his house felt haunted, that the basement window with its cracked glass seemed to watch them as they passed. Adults dismissed these fears, telling themselves Richard was simply private, eccentric perhaps, but harmless. In reality, Richard's life was a slow descent into darkness. He had grown up in the same town, worked odd jobs, but as years passed, he became more isolated. Inside his house, the curtains stayed drawn, the lights dim, and in the basement, he spent long hours writing in thick notebooks, filling pages with disturbing fantasies, sketches of chains, locked doors, and faceless figures. His obsession was growing, though no one knew it. On the night Sarah disappeared, Richard had been watching. He had seen her walk home many times before, her path predictable, her guard down in the familiarity of her neighborhood. That night, as she walked under the dim street lamps, he pulled his car slowly alongside her, rolling down the passenger window. Witnesses would later say they remembered a dark sedan in the area, but no one thought much of it. At the time, Sarah likely felt the unease too late. Richard spoke to her calmly, perhaps pretending to need directions, perhaps offering help, but in an instant, the situation shifted. He grabbed her, pulling her into the car, muffling her cries with one strong hand. The street was quiet, the houses dark, and within seconds, the young woman had vanished into the night. Down in Richard's basement, Sarah's world collapsed. The space smelled of mold and old concrete. A single dim bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Chains were bolted into the cement. A mattress, thin and stained, lay on the floor, and notebooks stacked on a table described his fantasies of control. Sarah was terrified, confused, her mind racing between disbelief and panic. She screamed until her throat was raw, but the basement was soundproof enough that no neighbor could hear. Richard visited her each day, not with kindness, but with cold precision. He offered her water, scraps of food, and spoke to her as though she were part of a plan only only he understood. Sarah begged him to let her go, reminding him of her family, her future, her humanity. But his eyes remained empty. To him, she was not Sarah, the bright student with dreams. She was simply the subject of his obsession, the fulfillment of years of twisted thoughts. Above ground, life went on. Her classmates continued classes. Her parents begged for updates. Detectives combed through her phone records, but nothing led them closer. What they didn't know was that Sarah was praying every night beneath their feet, praying that someone would hear, someone would notice, someone would care enough to look deeper. And slowly, cracks in Richard's perfect cover began to appear. One neighbor noticed the basement light was on at odd hours, sometimes past 3 a.m. Another thought they heard something strange, a sound like metal clinking, though they convinced themselves it must have been plumbing. These little details seemed insignificant until combined, and only then would they form the thread that unraveled Richard's secret. For now, Sarah endured the darkness, her mind fighting to stay stronger. She thought of her parents' voices, her friends' laughter, the sunlight on campus lawns. She repeated their names like mantras, each one a reminder that she existed, that she had to survive. And somewhere, though faint, hope lingered, because she knew the world outside was searching for her. She just didn't know how long it would take before someone opened the locked basement door and ended her nightmare.
The search for Sarah Miller grew more desperate with each passing day, and the town of Brooksville, once so ordinary and quiet, now seemed drenched in unease. Posters with Sarah's face stared down from every telephone pole, her eyes following neighbors as they walked their dogs, as they carried groceries, as they tried to live their normal lives while knowing something unthinkable had happened so close to home. Detectives knocked on doors, questioned students, and checked security cameras from gas stations and traffic lights, piecing together the last known steps of the missing girl. They discovered the call she made to her roommate at 9:47 p.m., the brief sighting of her walking down Oakwood Avenue by a passing driver, and then nothing. A vanishing act in a suburban street where life should have been predictable. The case grew colder by the day, the detectives frustrated, the family shattered, the community restless. Sarah's parents, John and Linda Miller, appeared on local television, pleading through tears for anyone with information to come forward. But Richard Coleman, sitting quietly in his dimly lit living room only blocks away, watched the broadcast with a detached calm, as though he were observing a movie rather than his own twisted reality. Richard's past held secrets that the town had long ignored. As a boy, he had been quiet, isolated, often bullied by his classmates for his awkwardness and strange obsessions. His father had left when he was only 8, and his mother, though hard-working, was distant and cold. Richard grew up retreating into his own world, spending hours drawing in notebooks, filling pages with dark imagery, locked doors, stick figures and chains, eyes staring from the margins of every page. Teachers noticed, but dismissed it as eccentricity. As a teenager, he was caught breaking into abandoned houses, lingering in basements, collecting broken locks and chains. No one ever connected those behaviors to something more dangerous. When his mother died, Richard inherited the house and slipped further into isolation. Years blended together as he worked odd jobs at hardware stores and repair shops where no one paid him much attention. Behind the closed curtains of his home, he built his own world, a basement that became a shrine to his obsessions. He collected old locks, chains, handcuffs, journals filled with fantasies of control and captivity. He rehearsed scenarios in his mind, refining every detail, waiting for the moment when imagination would no longer be enough. That moment came the night he saw Sarah walking home alone. In the basement, Sarah's willpower was being tested every day. She marked time by the sound of footsteps above her, by the dim bulb that Richard switched on when he descended with food or water. Sometimes he said nothing, staring at her with cold, evaluating eyes, as though she were an object, a specimen. Other times he spoke in calm, almost rehearsed sentences, telling her she was chosen, that she should stop resisting, that no one would ever find her. His words chilled her more than the cold concrete walls. Sarah tried to reason with him, tried to appeal to whatever shred of humanity might remain, but his face revealed nothing. In moments alone, she whispered prayers, pressed her ear against the walls, listened for any sound of life outside, but the basement was designed to keep her world contained. She thought of escape constantly, scanning for weaknesses, testing the chain that bound her wrist, imagining scenarios where she could run the moment he slipped. but Richard had thought of everything, or at least he believed he had. Meanwhile, the investigation took a new turn. Detective Mark Reynolds, a seasoned officer with graying hair and tired eyes, refused to let Sarah's case fade into another unsolved mystery. He revisited every detail, driving the streets she walked, studying the timeline minute by minute. His gut told him the answer was close, that Sarah had not simply vanished into another city, but was somewhere near. He re-interviewed neighbors, probing deeper this time. One neighbor mentioned seeing a dark sedan the night Sarah disappeared, moving slowly along the street. Another recalled a faint noise in the middle of the night, something metallic, though they weren't sure. A third neighbor pointed out that Richard Coleman's basement light had been on unusually late for several nights in a row. It was small, circumstantial evidence, but Reynolds felt a pull toward it. Richard's house, tucked neatly into the row of suburban homes, did not stand out, but his reclusive nature raised questions. Reynolds checked records and found Richard's past arrests for trespassing in abandoned buildings years ago. Minor offenses, but strange patterns. It was enough to plant suspicion. Back in the basement, Sarah clung to hope by recalling faces and voices from her life. She thought of her mother's hugs, her father's laughter, her roommate's chatter, the professors who believed in her potential. She recited lines of poetry she had studied, verses about endurance and survival. In the darkest hours of the night, when she felt despair pressing hardest, she promised herself she would not give Richard the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. Every breath she took was an act of defiance, every heartbeat a declaration that she was still alive. But Richard was slipping. The control he prized so much was fraying at the edges. He began drinking more heavily at night, sitting alone in the living room staring at his television, but barely processing the images. He grew paranoid, convinced that someone might suspect him. He double-checked locks, reinforced the basement door, but his hands trembled as he scribbled frantic notes in his journals. His obsession with Sarah was consuming him, pulling him into a spiral he could not escape. He told himself she was the fulfillment of his life's purpose, but deep down, he knew his fragile world could collapse with one mistake. Detective Reynolds decided to pay Richard a visit under the pretense of routine questioning. When Richard opened the door, Reynolds noticed the stale air of the house, the curtains drawn, the faint smell of mold that drifted from below. Richard answered politely, his voice steady, his eyes avoiding direct contact. He claimed he knew nothing of Sarah, that he rarely left his house, that he had been watching television the night she disappeared. Reynolds noted the nervous twitch of his hands, the way he shifted his weight uncomfortably. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to keep him watching. As he left the house, he glanced toward the basement window, the cracked glass reflecting faintly in the afternoon sun. For a brief second, he thought he heard something, a faint echo from below, but then a car passed and the sound was gone. Still, the image burned in his mind. The town's patience was wearing thin. Vigils were held in Sarah's honor, candles flickering in the night as her name was spoken in prayers. Reporters pressed for updates, but the police could only say the investigation was ongoing. Sarah's parents sat in the front row of each vigil, holding hands, their faces etched with grief but refusing to give up. Unknown to them, their daughter was alive, fighting in the shadows only a few streets away, and soon the careful web Richard had spun would begin to unravel, thread by thread, until the truth could no longer be hidden in the basement of secrets.
As days turned into weeks, the walls of Richard Coleman's fragile world began to crack, not from the outside at first, but from within. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to create order in the chaos of his mind, but keeping Sarah Miller imprisoned in his basement demanded a constant vigilance that was slowly unraveling him. He barely slept, pacing the creaking wooden floors of his house at night, jumping at the sound of barking dogs or passing cars. The television played endlessly in the background, news anchors repeating Sarah's name over and over, her face flashing on the screen, her smile haunting him from the glow of the screen. Each broadcast reminded him that the world was looking, searching, clawing closer to his secret. And though he tightened every lock and checked every corner of his home, Richard could feel the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest like a vice. His journals grew more frantic, filled not with careful sketches or methodical notes, but scribbles, half-coherent rants about fate, destiny, and the fear of being discovered. The man who once lived in shadows now felt the light inching toward him. In the basement, Sarah sensed his weakening grip. She studied his movements carefully whenever he descended the stairs with her meager meals, watching the way his hands trembled, the dark circles under his eyes, the distracted flicker in his gaze. He was unraveling, and with every sign of his mental collapse, Sarah's determination to survive burned brighter. She knew she could not wait for rescue alone. She had to play a role in her own survival. When Richard spoke to her, she began to answer in softer tones, less defiance, more calculation. She asked questions, not of freedom but of his life, his routines, as though she were trying to understand him. At first, he responded coldly, suspicious of her sudden change in demeanor. But as the days wore on, the isolation that had consumed him for years began to ache. For the first time in a long time, Richard had someone listening, and though his words were twisted and delusional, Sarah's feigned interest kept him talking. Every word he spoke gave her more information: when he left the house, what locks he checked, how paranoid he had become. Detective Mark Reynolds, meanwhile, could not let Richard slip from his thoughts. Something about the man lingered in his gut: the smell of mold in his house, the basement light burning at strange hours, the nervous way he answered simple questions. Though there was no concrete evidence, Reynolds requested surveillance. Unmarked cars began parking at the end of Richard's street, officers taking shifts to observe his movements. They saw his odd habits, taking the trash out at 3 a.m., buying large quantities of canned food, rarely interacting with anyone. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it painted a picture of a man with something to hide. Reynolds dug deeper, pulling old records, tracing Richard's past arrests, finding old complaints from neighbors about strange noises decades earlier. Though nothing directly tied him to Sarah, the puzzle pieces were aligning in his mind, and Reynolds knew it was only a matter of time before Richard made a mistake. And that mistake nearly came one stormy night. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder rolled across the sky, rattling the small house like a drum. Richard had been drinking heavily, pacing the living room with a bottle in his hand, his mind unraveling in a storm of paranoia. He stumbled down to the basement, muttering to himself, unlocking the door with shaky hands. Sarah sat quietly, her chain clinking faintly as she shifted on the mattress, her eyes widening at the sight of his unsteady state. He ranted about the police, about neighbors watching him, about the world being against him, his words slurred, his steps unsteady. And for the first time since her nightmare began, Sarah saw opportunity. When he dropped the bottle, the glass shattering across the concrete floor, he bent to pick it up, leaving his keys dangling loosely from his belt loop. Sarah's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to act. Slowly, carefully, she shifted closer, waiting for the moment. When Richard turned his back for only a second, she lunged forward, her chained wrist clinking against the floor as she snatched the keys. He spun around instantly, his face twisting in rage, and before she could react, his hand struck her across the face, sending her sprawling. The keys clattered to the ground, sliding out of reach. His scream filled the basement, a roar of fury as he grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently, spittle flying from his lips. "You think you can outsmart me?" he bellowed, his voice breaking. Sarah sobbed, not out of defeat, but out of frustration at how close she had been. Richard yanked the chain tighter, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild. That night, he reinforced her restraints, doubling the locks, checking them again and again until his fingers bled. But though Sarah failed, she had learned something critical. Richard was unstable, careless when drunk, and there would be another chance. The next morning, Richard tried to pretend nothing had happened, bringing her food with a forced calm, but his eyes darted nervously, his paranoia thicker than ever. He muttered under his breath, pacing as though the walls themselves were closing in. Sarah, though bruised and exhausted, refused to let despair consume her. She replayed every detail of the failed escape, every motion of his keys, every weakness in his routine. She knew now that patience was her weapon, and Richard's unraveling mind was her greatest ally. Outside, the investigation was circling closer. Surveillance teams noted his erratic late-night movements, his heavy drinking, his strange habit of never letting anyone near his property. Reynolds pushed for a warrant, but the lack of direct evidence held him back. Still, he trusted his instincts. He told his team, "He's hiding something down there. I can feel it." And in the basement, Sarah felt the same truth in her bones, that rescue was coming, but survival meant holding on a little longer, watching, waiting, and being ready when the next chance arrived.
The days that followed Sarah's failed escape attempt transformed Richard Coleman into a man consumed entirely by paranoia. He hardly slept, constantly moving through his dimly lit house like a restless shadow, checking locks, peering through blinds, scribbling in his notebooks, muttering under his breath about neighbors, police, and fate conspiring against him. The basement, once his sanctuary, now felt like both a trophy and a ticking time bomb. Sarah's very existence filled him with twisted pride, but also unbearable fear. He could not release her, he could not kill her, and yet he could not stop imagining imagining the inevitable knock on his door. The news continued to haunt him, Sarah's smiling face flashing every night, her parents begging for her return, detectives promising they would not rest until she was found. Richard sometimes switched the channel, but even then he felt as if the walls themselves whispered her name, as if the world outside was closing in inch by inch. His drinking worsened, his hands shook constantly, and his eyes were bloodshot from endless nights of pacing. In the basement, Sarah remained chained, but far from broken. Her face still bore the bruise from Richard's violent outburst, but her spirit refused to dim. She had learned something vital. Richard was losing control. His paranoia made him careless, his drinking made him sloppy, and every slip was an opportunity. She began to observe him with sharper focus, memorizing every gesture, every word, every routine. She noticed that when he was drunk, his grip on the keys was weaker, that sometimes he left them dangling too long when bending over. She noticed that he locked the basement door twice at night, but only once in the mornings when he rushed to bring her food. She noticed the way his steps echoed when he went upstairs, how long he spent in the bathroom, when he fell asleep in the armchair with the television humming. Each detail was a weapon, and Sarah stored them in her mind like arrows in a quiver, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Meanwhile, Detective Mark Reynolds pressed harder. Though still lacking hard evidence, he convinced his captain to authorize deeper surveillance on Richard. Plainclothes officers walked dogs near his house, pretending to be neighbors while listening for unusual sounds. Others noted that Richard had boarded up parts of his basement windows, an action strange for a man with no apparent renovations. Trash collectors were asked to discreetly check his bins, where they found old food containers far exceeding what a single man should consume, as though he were feeding someone else. Reynolds knew they were circling closer, but still lacked the smoking gun. He told his team, "If she's alive, she's down there, and if she's down there, every hour counts." The urgency in his voice grew sharper by the day. Richard, feeling the invisible eyes of the world upon him, began to spiral. He yelled at shadows, cursed at neighbors through the blinds, tore pages from his notebooks, and burned them in his sink. His paranoia was no longer quiet, but explosive. One afternoon, while driving to the store, he noticed a car following him for 2 blocks and panicked, swerving violently to lose it. He returned home sweating, convinced the police were watching. He stormed into the basement and screamed at Sarah, blaming her for everything, calling her cursed, telling her she had ruined his life. Sarah sat silently, her face calm despite the torrent of hatred pouring from him. She had realized something important. His anger was proof of weakness. The more he raged, the closer his collapse drew, and in his collapse she saw her chance. That night, as rain fell softly outside, Richard drank himself into a stupor and passed out in his armchair, the television flickering in the dark. Sarah listened carefully from the basement, counting the rhythm of the storm, the silence above her, the faint sound of his snores. She pulled at her chain, testing the strength of the bolt. It did not budge, but she noticed the metal ring was loosening slightly from the concrete with each tug. Her wrists bled as she twisted and yanked, but she ignored the pain, focusing only on the faint give of the metal. Hours passed, and just before dawn, she felt the bolt shift. Her heart thundered as the chain slipped free from the wall, though it remained locked around her wrist. She stood, trembling with both fear and adrenaline, and moved quietly toward the basement door. It was locked, as always, but she had something she didn't before: freedom of movement. She searched the basement desperately, finding nothing at first, only boxes, old tools, stacks of notebooks. Then, buried beneath a pile of rusted chains, she discovered a bent screwdriver. Her hands shook as she jammed it into the lock, twisting and prying, the metal squealing faintly with each attempt. Sweat dripped down her face, her breath coming in silent gasps, and her eyes were bloodshot from endless nights of pacing. After what felt like an eternity, the lock gave a faint click. Her eyes widened, her pulse raced, and she pushed the door gently open. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath her weight as she climbed, every sound magnified in her mind, every step a battle between hope and terror. She reached the top, her fingers trembling on the doorknob that led to the kitchen. She turned it slowly and froze. From the living room came a sound, a groan, the shifting of weight. Richard stirred in his chair. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She remained completely still, holding her breath, her entire body shaking. Seconds stretched into eternity until his snores resumed, deep and heavy. She exhaled silently, pushed the door open, and stepped into the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, she was above ground, the smell of the house filling her nostrils, the faint glow of early dawn spilling through the curtains. Her eyes darted to the front door. It was only a few feet away. Freedom was within reach, but then the floor betrayed her. A loose board creaked under her foot, loud enough to cut through the silence. From the living room came a guttural noise, a rustling of movement. Richard stirred again, muttering incoherently. Sarah froze, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure he would hear it. She only had seconds to decide: run for the door and risk waking him fully, or retreat back into the basement and lose her chance. Her body screamed for freedom, her legs trembling with the urge to sprint, but fear anchored her in place. Richard shifted again, this time sitting up, his silhouette moving in the flicker of the television. Sarah panicked, retreating silently back down the stairs, pulling the basement door closed just as his footsteps approached the kitchen. She slid into the shadows, clutching the chain against her chest, her body trembling with both despair and relief. She had been so close to freedom, but the nightmare was not yet over. Richard opened the basement door moments later, his eyes scanning the darkness. He stood there for a long time, swaying slightly, sniffing the air as though sensing something was wrong. His gaze lingered on the chain, now detached from the wall, and his face twisted in fury. He stormed down the stairs, his eyes wild, and grabbed Sarah by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "You think you can leave me?" he roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Sarah bit her lip to stop herself from crying out, refusing to give him the satisfaction. His rage exploded as he hurled the screwdriver across the room, its clatter piercing the silence. He doubled her restraints once more, chaining her ankles now in addition to her wrists, his paranoia sealing her tighter than before. But what he did not realize was that his rage had left evidence: scratches on the lock, disturbed dust on the stairs, small signs that an escape had been attempted, and soon those signs would not go unnoticed. Outside, the surveillance team recorded Richard's erratic behavior, noting how he staggered outside in the rain, shouting at shadows, checking his mailbox 3 times in a single night. Detective Reynolds watched the reports carefully, his gut telling him the time was coming. He pushed harder for a search warrant, arguing that every sign pointed to Richard hiding something. His persistence was beginning to pay off. The legal process was slow, but momentum was building, and Sarah's window of survival was aligning with the police's growing suspicion. She had been so close to freedom, but the story was not over, because sometimes the darkest hour comes just before the dawn. And the dawn was approaching Richard Coleman.
The town of Ravenbrook had never seen media vans parked on every corner, their antennas piercing the skies like watchtowers of truth. Satellite dishes lined the streets outside the courthouse, and news anchors in crisp suits rehearsed their live lines as the world turned its eyes on a sleepy community that once prided itself on quiet evenings and safe neighborhoods. But now, Ravenbrook was the epicenter of a crime so horrifying that it would scar its reputation for decades. Richard Coleman, the man who neighbors once described as ordinary, was finally facing the consequences of what he had done in the dark bowels of his basement. Sarah Miller, wrapped in a light blue cardigan, sat quietly with her family in the courtroom. Her face was pale but composed, her hands clutching a bottle of water, knuckles white with tension. Months of therapy had brought her some stability, but her eyes told the deeper truth, eyes that had seen the absence of sunlight, that had memorized the cracks in the cement walls of her prison, that had listened to the dripping pipes as a lullaby. Each flash of a camera, each whisper in the gallery, each look from Richard across the courtroom tightened the knot in her chest. The prosecution presented its case with relentless detail. They described how Richard meticulously reinforced the basement, building secret soundproofing, how he manipulated his neighbors with false charm
while hiding a horror only feet below their living rooms. Photos of the basement were displayed for the jury. The small mattress, the chain bolted to the floor, the bucket in the corner, the dim light bulb hanging from a frayed wire. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah had to testify. Her voice shook at first, words stumbling like a child learning to walk. But as she described the nights of fear, the constant dread that Richard might decide she was no longer useful to him, her voice grew steady. She recalled the muffled sounds of footsteps above her, her desperate attempts to count the days by scratching marks into the wall with her fingernails. At one point she broke down, tears flooding her face, forcing the judge to call for a short recess. But when she returned, she looked directly at Richard, her voice unwavering as she said, "You thought you could erase me from the world, but I'm still here, and I will never let you erase my voice." The defense tried to paint Richard as mentally unstable, a man suffering from paranoia and untreated illness. They argued he wasn't a monster, but a broken human who had lost control of his mind. But the prosecution countered with chilling evidence. Journals Richard kept, written in neat handwriting, detailing his plans for Sarah and disturbing fantasies of control. He wasn't insane, he was deliberate. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with a verdict guilty on all charges, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. Richard showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, and in that single moment, Ravenbrook released the breath it had been holding for months. Yet justice didn't erase the shadows. For Sarah, freedom was not the same as normalcy. Nights were the hardest, dreams pulling her back into the basement, her body jolting awake with phantom sounds of dripping pipes. She couldn't enter dark rooms without trembling. Crowded spaces suffocated her because she had been hidden away from the world too long. Therapy sessions became her safe space, a place where she could untangle the web of fear Richard had spun around her. The town itself struggled too. Neighbors who once exchanged polite greetings now looked at each other with suspicion. Parents kept children closer. Curtains stayed drawn. The Coleman house was eventually demolished, but people swore the land itself felt cursed, an unspoken reminder of what had happened beneath its foundation. The story spread worldwide, dominating headlines and sparking endless debates on safety, trust, and the monsters that can live among us. Documentaries were made. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Writers published books with dramatic titles, but Sarah's voice rose above them all. She agreed to one carefully chosen interview, not for fame, but to deliver a message. Sitting beneath bright studio lights, she looked into the camera and said, "Evil doesn't always look like the villain in your imagination. Sometimes it looks like the neighbor who smiles at you in the morning. Be aware, trust your instincts, and if you ever feel trapped, remember, you are stronger than the darkness."